Hello everyone and welcome. For today's video, I have been testing the Vitamix to determine whether it can be used to grind your coffee. And not just whether it can, but if it can make good coffee as well. These are very expensive blenders with a lot of power, and I was curious whether they could be used for this purpose. Let's take a look at the Vitamix and some of the tests that I've done, and we'll see what conclusions we can come up with. Also, please don't forget to subscribe as it helps me out a lot. We are getting closer to 1,000 subscribers, but a lot of the people who watch my videos don't subscribe. And I know we could reach our goal so much quicker if you click that subscribe button right below this video. So to start with the basics, the Vitamix would certainly be considered a blade grinder. These blades of metal are rotating at very fast speeds, boosted by a powerful motor. Any coffee beans that hit these blades will be shattered into a variety of different sizes. We already face some challenges here due to the fact that blade grinders don't control particle size very well. Unlike burr grinders, there's nowhere that the grinds are being funneled out in evenly shaped sizes. The loose coffee is simply spinning around the chamber, being chopped little by little. A further issue to note is that there is some significant clearance below the blades and around the sides. Even a whole bean could sit below the blades and avoid being chopped. For testing purposes, this meant that for my initial attempt, I wanted to put the beans in directly in the top while the blades were spinning around already at a high speed. I didn't want to give the beans a chance to stay under the blades, so I figured if it was already running at a high speed, it would be much harder for grinds to slip through. In this attempt, I only used a few beans as I didn't know what would happen at first and I didn't want things to be too chaotic. I should note though that even with just 5 beans, it was pretty messy. You can see how they are very aggressively thrown around the chamber at such high speeds. There was a very interesting effect though, and that was that the beans were shattered very quickly into small pieces, and I couldn't see them anymore after a few seconds. I looked to the top of the chamber and realized that the grounds had become small enough and light enough to float to the top and stay there by the air that was blowing around from the blade. The grinds looked alright, but I took them out and saved them for some analysis later in the video. In the second attempt, I added more beans, about 22 grams, the same amount that I use for my pour-overs in the morning. I wanted to see how this would feel if someone ground their coffee fresh every morning with the Vitamix. Of course, this turned out to be an even greater mess than before, even if you get the plug back on quickly. Besides that, it was really interesting to see the grinds moving around so quickly and being able to stay above the blades. It seems that my approach of dropping the beans in while the blades are on was the best way to keep the grinds from hiding underneath the blades. And this meant that more of the grounds were being constantly involved in the grinding process, which promoted a higher level of uniformity in particle size. Again, I won't comment too much on how it looked with the naked eye, but here's a photo of those grinds. You can see some obviously larger and smaller particles. It's not great, but it could be worse. I gathered up the grinds and set them aside for analysis as well. One other thing I noticed was that in both attempts, there was a fine layer of brown dust coating the sides of the chamber. Brushing it down the sides and collecting it at the bottom, I noticed, of course, that it was just very, very fine particles of coffee, but it might even be too fine for something like espresso. This was also a cause for concern with the Vitamix because it meant that, to some extent, some amount of beans were being shattered into a dust-like particle size, while others remained quite large. But as they remained on the sides of the chamber, even while removing the other grinds, I figured they could be easily left out of a brew of coffee, and I chose not to include them in my analysis later on. In my third and final attempt, I added way more beans, and I decided that I wouldn't make another mess. I put the beans in the chamber, locked it, and turned it on. And with Vitamix, you need to start at 1. You can't just start at 10 or it might hurt your motor. So I turned it on and slowly increased the speed. At around 8 though, I realized that there was no point going any further. I'd already ground for about 30 seconds at this point, and it sounded like the blades were no longer actively chopping anything else. On closer inspection, the grounds had found a place to rest under and around the blades that avoided further contact with it. And even those that were in contact with the blade were just being pushed around as opposed to being chopped. These were the results, and I decided not to save them for later. It was pretty obvious that these would not produce a good cup of coffee. A large amount of particle sizes are far too coarse, and they could possibly pass for a cold brew style grind. So let's look at some of the nerdy stuff. I took each of the first two grind samples, as well as a sample of my home grinder, which is the Fellow Ode, and a sample from the EK43, which is a very expensive commercial grinder. I sprinkled them on some white paper, taking extra care to spread the particles out so they weren't touching each other. I included a quarter for reference, and I took photos of each sample. I ran these photos through some processing by using a wonderfully designed program by astrophysicist and coffee enthusiast Jonathan Gagne. He created this software with the ability to determine the particle size distribution of a sample of coffee. This is where you can see how similarly sized and uniform the particles of coffee are. A grinder is doing a better job than another grinder when it can produce a larger amount of ground particles at the same size, with the least amount of coffee particles that vary from that size. At the end of the program, you are left with a chart that gives you an idea of how well your grinder is doing at producing similarly sized particles. Here are the 4 that I produced from my samples, and keep in mind that I'm still getting used to using this program and reading these charts, but I think we can safely take note of a few things. First, the 2 Vitamix samples have a fairly wide distribution. More particles are spread into many sizes, and this will make it harder to evenly extract your coffee. Second, the EK grinder performs reasonably well while the burrs inside are probably 1 or 2 years old. You can see how more particles are focused in one area. And third, the Ode grinder I have is fairly new, and you can see that it has a fairly narrow distribution, with most grinds falling into the same category or close to it. I know we probably didn't need to do all that testing to figure it out, but it's kind of nice to have something more than just a visual to go on. At this point, I would say that you probably shouldn't be grinding your coffee on the Vitamix. The main issue is not so much that you can't control the grind size or the evenness of the grind, even though that is still an issue. It's actually looking more like a logistical issue. Going back to the fact that the best results came when I was able to dump the beans in directly while the machine was already on, I can't imagine anyone putting up with that level of messiness every day, especially in the morning, without coffee, and it becomes unrealistic to me to use. Then, even if you did find a way to reduce the mess, you'd still be left with a range of particle sizes that is far too wide, and you'd be better off going with an entry-level grinder like the Baratza Encore or a hand grinder. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching, and please hit that subscribe button right below this video. Give me a like if you enjoyed it, and I'd love to hear from you, especially if you have any experience in the past with blade grinders. Have they made any good coffee for you? I will see you all in the next video. Have a great day.